Greetings folks, Iolair here. This video is the second in a two-part review of the new premium tier 9 German super heavy cruiser, the Ägir. In the first part I have a replay with commentary and I'll leave a link to that video in the description below. In this video I will be going over the ship specifications while in port. I'll also go over my build in more detail as well as some variations on the build that you may want to consider, and then I'll have some final thoughts about the ship and the value in purchasing her. So thank you very much for joining me. I hope you enjoy the video. All right, here we are back in port with the Ägir in Hamburg. I'm going to do a walkthrough of her specifications as well as my ship build, and I'll talk about some variations in the build that you may want to consider. I will try to make this part of the video as concise as I can, so if there are any questions or details that you would like to get answered that maybe I didn't cover or need to clarify, feel free to leave your comments or leave your questions, in the comments, and I'll be happy to answer them or try to get you to a resource that can answer them. So starting with her armor, the Ägir is a quite well armored cruiser. She has the 27mm bow and stern, which allows her, when well angled, to bounce the 380 and 381mm AP, common to quite a few mid and upper tier battleships. She has a 30mm deck, which is important because it means that AP calibers below 430 millimeters, if they come in at a shallow enough angle, here, I'm trying to get a good view here. If they come in at a shallow enough angle, basically below 30 degrees, they will bounce off the deck. So again, that's for AP calibers below 430 millimeters. For larger caliber AP, so the Republic at 431, the Yamato, the Musashi, Kremlin, Ohio, I almost said Colbert, the Georgia, and the Thunder, those larger calibers will overmatch the deck armor regardless of angle and will get into the ship, either causing a penetration or over penetration. Or in the case of plunging fire, quite likely could get into the citadel and cause citadel damage. So her superstructure is 16 millimeters, which is standard for this tier. Her turrets are actually quite well armored or in fact very well armored for a cruiser. The 360 millimeter frontal plate is not quite battleship level of armor at this tier, but it's not too far off. And it means that AP shells of most any caliber that come in are very likely to bounce unless they are fired at very close range and the shells are almost perpendicular to the plate. These turrets should be pretty survivable. Okay, so her side armor is quite thick, which has its advantages and disadvantages. So the advantages are that if the ship is well angled like this, all AP calibers will bounce off her upper and lower belt. So her upper belt is 90 millimeters, her lower belt is 190 millimeters, The downside of having such a thick belt, however, especially the upper belt, means that AP shells that do penetrate, if they're coming in at the right angles, it's not too shallow, and they do penetrate, they are much more likely to arm within the ship and cause penetrating damage as opposed to causing over penetrations. So one of the frustrations I know of many battleship players is that when they're firing at a lot of cruisers, they tend to get a lot of overpens, and Wargaming has designed the mechanic that a lot of these cruisers have narrower hulls and they have thinner armor sides. So shells that come in do not arm by the time they get into the ship. They arm after they've exited the ship on the other side, causing a over-penetration. That is not generally going to be the case for the Ägir and the Siegfried. So this is, again, a downside of having such thick armor on the upper side, especially on the upper side of the armor belt. So as is the case with all of the upper tier German heavy cruisers, as well as obviously the battleships, the Ägir does carry the turtleback. That is the slope deck that sits in front of the citadel. The citadel is quite low in the water, just looks like it comes up above the waterline just a tad. But what it means is that shells that come in through the main belt and strike this sloped plate have a decent chance of deflecting upwards and detonating above the citadel. So you will still take penetrating damage, but in close engagements, you're more likely to avoid a citadel hit because the shells are bouncing off this slope deck and detonating above the citadel. Now, as is the case, or I suspect is the case for the Ägir, as we see with other German heavy cruisers, is that they tend to be quite vulnerable to citadel hits through plunging fire. So shells that are coming from long ranges that are more perpendicular to the deck will come through the deck and into the citadel, and obviously the turtleback doesn't help in that case. So the turtleback is mainly to help for those close engagements within 6, maybe 8 kilometers. Okay, so that's our armor. Survivability is quite good. 62,850 hit points. This is again the case for both the Ägir and the Siegfried. This is only bested by the Kronstadt with 71,050. So the Ägir and Siegfried have the second highest HP pools of the Tier 9 supercruisers. The torpedo protection is remarkably good, especially for a cruiser. So by contrast, the Tier 9 and Tier 10 German battleships, the Friedrich, der Große, and the Große Kurfürst, both have torpedo protection in the 20% range, or 20 to 30% range, whereas the Ägir is 37%, which is not only quite good for a battleship, but is remarkably good for a cruiser. So some very good torpedo protection. Now we get to the guns. So I think most people know she has 3 turrets, triple guns, or 3 guns per turret, so 9 in total, 305 millimeter caliber. The base reload is 20 seconds with the main battery modification 3 upgrade in slot 6, which is what I take. The reload comes down to 17.6 seconds. The turret rotation is quite good at 30 seconds for 180 degrees in 30 seconds. Now, because I have the main battery modification 3 upgrade in slot 6, that reduces the turret traverse to 34 seconds and change. But I take the main battery modification 2 upgrade in slot 3 to recover some of that. You could also take expert marksman, and again, I'll talk about some build options here once I get to the captain. But basically, what I'm looking for when I play cruisers is whether my turrets can keep up with me in a full turn. At 30 seconds for the 180 degrees, it can do that. So the HE shell characteristics are kind of typical for the Germans. They are the worst alpha for their caliber among all of their peers. So the Kronstadt, with its 305 millimeter HE, the alpha is 4,200. With the Azuma with a 310 millimeter, it's 5,100. For the Ägir, it's 3,600. So this is the lowest. She has a decent fire chance of 27%. That matches what you get with the Azuma. So the fire chance is respectable. And obviously where the HE shines is in the penetration. So the Ägir does get the 1/4 penetration benefit of the German cruisers and battleships. So she can penetrate 76 millimeters. This allows her, unlike all of her peers, to be able to get through those 60 millimeter surfaces on some of these upper tier Soviet and Japanese battleships. The Izumo has some 57 millimeter surfaces. The Yamato, the Kremlin, the Sovietsky Soyuz, they all have some 60 millimeter surfaces as well. And these shells will be able to get through that. Again, unlike their peers who can penetrate up into the 50 millimeter areas, these are quite a bit higher. The AP is where the Ägir shines, in my opinion, and you probably noticed in the replay I shared, I was firing exclusively AP, and again, I'll talk more about my build in terms of some considerations there, especially with regard to expert loader. The alpha is the highest at caliber at 9100. This is actually reduced from what it was originally designed. So in the original testing of the Ägir, the AP shell damage was going to be 9600, I believe. This was reduced before she was released, but it is still the highest at caliber for her tier. So again, a characteristic of the German AP shells. The range is 18.5 kilometers. That is again without the range upgrade. The Ägir also does not get a spotter plane, which again I'll talk to when I get to my build. But if you were to take the gunfire control system upgrade in slot 6, which I do not take, but if you were to take it, the range gets out to 21.4 kilometers roughly. So it gets quite a bit more range. I generally have found that I don't need that additional range too often. But again, I'll talk a little bit more about the build options here in a moment. The AP and HE shell characteristics in terms of ballistics are identical. So you don't have to like adjust your lead or anything depending upon the shell type that you're firing. At 865 meters per second, these are the second fastest of the super cruisers at Tier 9. The Kronstadt has 900 and 920 meters per second, so they're a little more railgunny. But at 865 meters per second, these shells are pretty easy to get on target at range. You don't. These aren't particularly lofty shells. Her secondaries. She carries 9 turrets with 2 barrels each. The 128 millimeter guns. These are the same as on the Gneisenau Bravo hull, as well as the Grosse Kurfürst. They do get the 1/4 penetration, so they do get the 32 millimeter pen. That allows them to actually do damage when they are hitting. The range is the standard, cruiser range at 5.3 kilometers. But the penetration in particular again allows them to actually do damage rather than just showing up as a token purple ribbon on your on your results. They can actually do some work. And again, from the replay that I shared, it was actually my secondaries that got the kill on the North Carolina. It wasn't the torpedoes. Now, I think many people are aware that in the previous incarnation of the Ägir, Wargaming had sort of spec'd into this super secondary build with battleship level range and buffed accuracy or reduced dispersion like that on the Graf Zeppelin. I personally am glad that Wargaming did not go with that model, because this is still a cruiser, and while she is a quite well armored cruiser, she cannot tolerate prolonged sort of close engagements with battleships for those secondary fights, like her battleship peers, the Große Kurfürst, the Friedrich der Große, Bismarck, etc. She simply can't do that. So I am personally glad that Wargaming didn't keep that and sort of entice people to lull them into a sense that they should, I should build this into a secondary spec. No, you want to have survivability. You have to treat this like a cruiser, a very powerful cruiser, obviously, but you still need to treat it like a cruiser. So I'm glad that Wargaming sort of rescinded that to implementation model. And as I mentioned earlier, the main battery range is 18.5 kilometers. Okay, torpedoes. She gets a single quadruple launcher on each side. These are the standard set of German torpedoes that you see on the Tirpitz, the Rhone, the Hindenburg, the Mainz, etc. They go 6 kilometers. They have a pretty low alpha of 13,700. They reload in 90 seconds. They have decently low detectability, but the reality is, with a range of 6 kilometers, your opponents know that you're sending torpedoes, even if they can't see them. So it's not particularly important necessarily, in my opinion, that the detectability be particularly low, but it is nice to know that it's there. And then the speed is quite good at 65 knots. So again, if you're employing these in these sort of close combat situations and ambush YOLO situations, this speed is perfectly fine to be able to get all torpedoes on target without them being able to avoid them. Okay, AA. She has, at least in terms of her rating, she has particularly good AA. In fact, she has the best AA of the Tier 9 supercruisers. I believe only the Neptune of all of the Tier 9 cruisers actually has a better base AA level. I think it's mainly because of the dual purpose 128 millimeter guns. In fact, the Siegfried, I think its rating is 80, yes, because it carries 2 fewer of the 128 millimeter dual purpose long range artillery AA guns. So the Ägir has quite, at least on paper, has quite good AA. I carry the Hydro because this is a German ship, and again, I'll talk more about the Hydro here in a moment. But the AA is competent enough that you can shoot down stuff with some reliability. Now, one area that I'm going to call out that is kind of unique to the German ships is her range. So she has her AA range, her long AA range is 6 kilometers, and this is quite unique. The German cruisers and battleships have reasonably competent AA, but the range is much shorter. So, for example, if I look at the Rhone, her range is only 5.2 kilometers, and that's the norm for the upper tier German cruisers. So the Siegfried and the Ägir at 6 kilometers is almost a, well, not quite 20% improvement in terms of the range. So that's uncharacteristic of German ships, even the German battleships. Let's take a look at those here. I think the Friedrich, her range is 5.6, 5.2 all as well. So again, quite uncharacteristic of German ships at these tiers to have 6 kilometer range. So that's definitely a benefit for her AA. Maneuverability, again, rather uncharacteristic of German cruisers, which are the slowest of their peers. The Hipper, the Prinz Eugen, Rhone, Hindenburg all have maximum speeds of 32 knots. That can get up to 33.6 with a Sierra Mike signal. The Ägir and the Siegfried have maximum speeds of 33.5 knots, which can be increased to 35.2 knots, as I have here with a Sierra Mike signal. So these are quite a bit quicker, or a little bit quicker than their siblings. And again, that's uncharacteristic of German cruisers. Now, both the Siegfried and the Ägir, these are big ships, so their turning circles are big. 880 meters, excuse me, is pretty big. That's pretty much battleship level. It's not as bad as like the Kurfürst, which has a turning radius of more than a kilometer, but that's still pretty big. The rudder shift is 11.2 seconds, and this is with the steering gears modification 2 upgrade in slot 4. This is definitely playable for a ship of this size and characteristics. So this rudder shift is pretty good. And then concealment is okay. Again, these are big ships. They are going to be pretty easily detected at 11.9 kilometers. This is still slightly better than a best concealed Hindenburg at 12.6. This is actually technically better than a York, which is at 12 or 12.1. But they are still not going to be very stealthy. These are going to be pretty easily detected cruisers, but because they are long range artillery cruisers and they tend to operate at ranges outside of their surface detection range, it's relatively easy to basically stop firing your guns and drop into concealment when you need to. So this is a playable detection range. Keep in mind this includes the camouflage, the concealment systems upgrade in slot 5, and the concealment expert skill. Okay, so those are the characteristics. Let's go ahead and get to the build. So starting with the upgrades, main armaments modification 1 in slot 1. That to me is the only choice for the vast majority of ships other than carriers and arguably possibly some battleship builds, but even there I almost always take main armaments modification 1 because most of your damage is almost always from your main battery, and this also helps with survivability of your torpedoes as well. For slot 2, I elect to take the hydroacoustic search modification, which extends the action time of the hydro. This is the German hydro, 6 kilometer ship detection, 4 kilometers on the torpedoes. I do like having the extended duration of the hydro for those circumstances where you're hunting down other ships, or you've got a destroyer on the flank that is sending torpedoes at you. To me, this is a very useful upgrade. If you don't have the coal to spend, or you're uninterested in getting the upgrade, I would recommend the damage control system modification upgrade to give yourself a little more tankiness, reduce the chance of flood and fire. I found that her rudder and her engine don't get knocked out too often, so the engine room protection, which is what I would normally take on a lot of cruisers, instead, I find it wouldn't be so much of an issue here. I think the damage control would be the better option. All right, slot 3. This is where there's a significant consideration in the build for each player. So because I am using the main battery modification 3 upgrade in slot 6, which worsens turret rotation, but I want to be able to keep my turrets on target, I elect to take the main battery modification 2. One thing that I didn't cover regarding her artillery, her dispersion is pretty good. Her maximum dispersion is 203 meters at the 18.5 kilometers. That goes up to 224 meters, I think, if you put on the gunfire control system upgrade in slot 6 to extend the range. But she does get 2.05 Sigma, which is the same as the other upper tier German heavy cruisers. So the grouping of the shells will still be very good. So I generally have found that I don't need to necessarily tighten up my salvos. So that coming back to the upgrades, the reason I mentioned the dispersion is because another option would be the aiming systems to tighten up the dispersion of the shells by 7%. This reduces the dispersion at maximum range from 203 meters down to, I think it's 194 meters. So a little bit tighter. To me, it's not so critical. I prefer to keep my guns on target. Again, I will get to the skill selection. So another option would be to take Expert Marksman to recover most of the turret rotation impact from taking the main battery modification 3 upgrade in slot 6 and take the aiming systems here. So either turret rotation here on the upgrade or through Expert Marksman, one of the two I think would be advisable if you are going to take the reload upgrade in slot 6. That's basically what it comes down to. Okay, slot 4, again, to me, I like having the extra steering gear maneuverability, especially when you're kiting and you're working as sort of the long-range artillery cruiser. I can see an argument for the damage control system upgrade to reduce the duration of floods and fires, but you're not going to be sort of that frontline tanking battleship, or at least you can play that way in certain circumstances, but that isn't the norm. So I would recommend, or at least for me, the steering gears is the better choice in this case. So the 5th slot, Concealment. Again, kind of like with slot 1, with the main armaments modification 1, to me here in slot 5, the only logical choice for me, and in my opinion, is the concealment system. I can see that some players might say, hey, I'm willing to give up the concealment to get better rudder shift and be able to dodge shots more easily with the steering gears. There are a few cases where I can see that, but with the Ägir, I can't see it. Especially since the range is 18.5 kilometers, I think it's going to be necessary to have maximum concealment so that you can drop off detection when you need to, in case you're starting to get focused or draw the attention of ships you don't want to. So concealment to me here in slot 5 is the most important. Okay, and then slot 6 is again a serious consideration point for players. So the choice to me is between the reload with the main battery modification 3, which is what I've taken, or the gunfire control system upgrade to increase your range by 16%. So if you prefer the longer range, again, this gets you out to 21.4 kilometers. If you prefer the longer range, you definitely are going to want to take the aiming systems upgrade in slot 3 to tighten up your shells, because also you don't incur a turret rotation impact from taking the gunfire control system. The reason I don't care for this is because cruisers are all about DPM, and with a few exceptions in various ships, having faster reload is usually the better choice. There are some exceptions, like with the Zhao and maybe a couple others, where having the increased range is more beneficial. But for purposes of the Ägir, in my experience and the way that I think that she is best played, having faster reload, with the main battery modification 3, for me works better. So, but again, this is a consideration point depending upon how you like to play your ships. So those are the upgrades. Let's go ahead and get to the commander skills. So with this commander, I went with the core set of 4 survivability tank skills. So basics of survivability, superintendent, concealment expert, and fire prevention. So again, these super cruisers, they have 60-second fires. They're big targets. They're going to draw a lot of fire. So being able to maximize survivability is most important, especially because of the 60-second fires. If they had 30-second fires like traditional cruisers do, you could trade off either basics of survivability or fire prevention, or both, for other skills. But for the super cruisers, I don't recommend that. Now, the only other consideration, this is the difference between how I the commander for my Siegfried and the commander for my Ägir. So on my Siegfried, I took Expert Marksman. So to offset the turret rotation impact of the main battery reload or the main battery modification 3 upgrade in slot 6, and I used the aiming systems upgrade to keep those 6 shells that I do have on target as much as possible. Now with the Ägir, because she has more shells that she fires. Plus, I had expected that I would fire HE more frequently with the Ägir than I have been doing with the Siegfried. I elected to go with Expert Loader. The other consideration is that I'm using this commander as my specialized commander for my Scharnhorst in a tank build, and the Scharnhorst definitely benefits from Expert Loader and definitely does not require Expert Marksman because her turrets are already stupid fast for a battleship and for her maneuverability. So having Expert Loader here to me is definitely useful for the Scharnhorst. I thought it would be useful here for the Ägir, but frankly, in the first dozen or 15 games that I've had with the Ägir, I haven't been using the Expert Loader skill much. So unlike the 203 millimeter heavy cruisers of the Hindenburg, the Holm, the Hipper classes, where I use Expert Loader all the time, I'm constantly switching ammunition types. I haven't been doing that with the Ägir, so there's an argument to be made, depending upon how you like to play, that maybe you could forego 2 of these 1-point skills and go with something else. Now, if I were to go with something else, I would probably pick up Jack of all trades to reduce the cooldown on my consumables. That to me would probably be the better choice. Again, an argument could be made to take Expert Marksman instead, and then take the aiming systems upgrade in slot 3 to tighten up those calibers, tighten up those salvos. So these are considerations that you may want to have for your build. Okay, last area I'll touch on real quickly are signals. So getting over to signals, yes, I have quite a few signals, although I'm out of papas right now. This is what I've been, well, ignoring the economic signals, just focusing on the combat signals. Spec it up like a battleship. So kind of the bottom 6 here. So the November Foxtrot reduces cooldown on the consumables. Sierra Mike improves your speed. The India Delta increases the rate at which you recover health when you use your repair party consumable. Now, one thing that I can, so there's that. Then there's the Juliet Yankee bonus 2, which reduces flooding recovery time. Again, if you're in a situation where your your damage control is on cooldown, this can give you some buffer in the event that you're flooding, although flooding is not once the threat that it was in the past. The India Yankee signal reduces fire duration, and then the all-important Juliet Charlie signal to prevent you from detonating. Now, again, not everybody has a plethora of signals or can't afford to buy them. I get it. So, but if you are able to use some or all of the combat signals, those would be the ones that I would use. Considerations whether you even want to spend the million free XP. Each player has to make this decision on their own based on the types of ships that they like to play and obviously their availability of free XP and so forth. Me being a German ship or having a bias for German ships, of course, I'm going to get the Ägir, even if it was the worst ship in the game. So I have a bias. But trying to be objective, what I would say is if you like long-range cruiser or long-range artillery cruiser playstyles, that you like the German cruiser playstyle where you're working from long range most of the battle and then you can close in during late game to take down isolated opponents in close combat, things like that. The Ägir is very well suited for that playstyle, and I think you would really enjoy her for that. And I think that if you have the million free XP and you're willing to consider that, this would be an excellent choice. But a million free XP is a lot of experience to use for this. So there may be other free XP ships that you're looking at that better fit your playstyle or your interest levels. So this is just a consideration point. So that will conclude my review of the Ägir. If you do consider getting her, I wish you all the best in luck and success in playing her. And I hope that the input here and my suggestions on the build are useful. And with that, we hope to see you out there on the virtual seas, and we wish you happy sailing.